They mocked her for burying firewood beneath her cabin. Before the first snow of that season had even settled into a proper drift, half the county had heard of it, and most of them laughed. The demonstration had been Eliza Kirkland's own idea, and that was the bitter part of it afterward. Nobody had forced her hand. The town council of Larkspur Hollow had put out word that autumn that they were taking bids for the winter relief woodlet, a standing contract to keep 60 cords banked and dry through the cold months for the poorhouse, the schoolhouse, and the widows who couldn't split their own kindling. Silas Pruitt, who ran the only proper woodyard in 3 townships, assumed the contract was his before a single bid was read aloud. He had reason to assume it. He had the largest shed in the hollow, iron-strapped and shingled, 40 feet of stacked oak and ash under one roof. Eliza had no shed at all. What she had was 11 acres of low, stony ground her father left her, land so poorly drained that even the county surveyor had once called it fit for frogs and little else, and a cabin sunk half into a hillside, because that was the only foundation the rock allowed. She had scrap wood, the Culdens other woodcutters didn't want, warped boards, green cuts nobody would pay for. And she had one idea, inherited along with the land, of a different way to keep wood through a winter. She proposed to bury it. Not in a pit dug in desperation, she told the council, but by design, a cache set below the frost line, packed and sealed so the ground's own steady cold, colder than the air some days and warmer than at other days, kept the wood from freezing solid to itself, kept it dry, kept it splittable with an axe instead of a chisel and a prayer. She said a man could dig into Pruitt's shed in January and find a wall of ice-fused cordwood he'd have to hack apart log by log. She said her wood would come up clean. Pruitt laughed first and loudest, and the line traveled through the hollow faster than the snow that would follow it. The woman wants to bury her firewood like it's a dead dog. Only difference is a dog knows enough to stay buried. The council, half amused and half genuinely curious, agreed to let her prove it. 7 days. Dig the cache, bury a quarter cord, open it before witnesses, and let the wood speak for itself. She dug in a hurry, because a hurry was all the calendar gave her. For feet down through clay gone half to ice already at the edges, no drainage channel beneath it. Packed with straw she hadn't cured long enough, and covered over with dirt she hadn't tamped in layers, only shoveled and stamped once with her boot heel. On the 7th day, with the council standing in the yard and Pruitt leaning on his wagon with his arms crossed and a grin already composed for the moment, she opened the cache. Meltwater had pooled at the bottom in the week's one warm afternoon, then frozen hard when the cold came back. The wood wasn't dry. It wasn't even loose. It was locked in a slab of gray ice, and when Eliza's ally, a young farmhand named Hollis Reed, drove a mattock into it to break it free, the frozen crust cracked wrong, and a chunk of stone-hard clay caught him across the shin and dropped him in the yard. Bramble, her hound, had been pacing the rim of the pit the whole morning with his hackles up, and when the ice gave way with a sound like a rifle crack, he bolted clean through the fence line and didn't come back until dusk. The council didn't need to see more. The contract went to Pruitt within the hour, unanimous. And 3 days later a formal letter arrived from the town selectman, Mr. Amos Whitfield, stating that Eliza Kirkland's land was, by unanimous council opinion, unsuited for the storage of provisions of any kind, and that further public demonstrations on town green would require prior council approval. It was not cruelty, exactly. It only felt like it. She had inherited the idea, as she'd inherited the land, from her father. Tobias Kirkland had been a trapper before he was a farmer, a man who wintered alone in country where a woodshed would have been buried under 12 feet of drift by December regardless of how well it was built, and who had learned, from an old Meadish trapper north of the Assiniboine, that the ground itself could be made to hold wood the way a root cellar held potatoes. Not frozen, not rotted, just held. When he settled the hollow land nobody else wanted, he'd kept a notebook of it, half trapping journal and half ledger, and Eliza had read pieces of it as a girl without understanding most of what she read. After he died, she'd packed the notebook into a trunk and hadn't opened it in 4 years. She opened it again the night after Whitfield's letter came, not out of hope, but because she wanted to know exactly how badly she had botched a thing her father had apparently done well. She found it in the 3rd entry she read. Her father had never buried wood in raw clay. He'd dug through the clay and into the sand seam beneath it, 18 inches further than she had gone, and he had lined the pit, not with straw alone, but with a layer of stripped birch bark laid shingle fashion, bark side down, and a second layer of hardwood ash spread an inch thick beneath that, to draw moisture rather than trap it. He had cut 2 narrow drainage notches at the low corners of the pit, angled outward, so that any water that did collect had somewhere to go besides pooling under the stack. And he had timed the burial 3 full weeks before the first hard freeze, not after the ground had already begun locking up, so the earth could settle and seal itself slowly around the wood instead of freezing mid-collapse. There was a number circled twice in the margin, 41 degrees. That was the temperature, he'd written, that a cache dug this way held steady at, regardless of what the air above it was doing, so long as the frost line above it stayed undisturbed. She had gone 4 feet down. He had gone 5.5. She had used straw she'd cut a week prior. He had used bark cured a full season. She had packed the earth in one pass. He had packed it in layers, tamping each one before adding the next, the way a man packs a pipe. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow was interested in hearing that Eliza Kirkland intended to try again. Whitfield's letter sat folded on her table as a plain enough answer to that. So she worked alone, and she worked quietly, in the weeks that followed, at a pace that would have looked to any passerby less like industry than like grief. She kept a ledger now, her father's habit taken up whole, a plain marbled notebook in which she recorded depth in inches, bark cure time in days, ash quantity in handfuls, drainage notch angle in degrees estimated by eye. 6 test pits, dug in secret on the far side of her own hill where the road couldn't see her digging. 4 of them failed in small, instructive ways. 1 flooded despite the notches because she'd cut them too shallow. 1 held dry, but the wood inside came up scorched smelling from ash packed too close against the grain. 1 collapsed at the lip when she hadn't tamped the topmost layer enough to bear a boot's weight. She wrote each failure down beside its cause, the way her father had, in a hand that got steadier with every entry even as her days got harder. Hollis Reed's shin healed slower than his pride did. He came back to help her dig the 5th test pit only because she asked him directly, and even then he stood at the edge of it for a long moment before picking up a shovel. "Folks are saying I'm simple for coming back out here," he told her, not unkindly, just plainly, the way a man states a fact he's tired of carrying. "Pruitt's boy offered me steady wages splitting at the yard. Good wages. And here I am digging a hole for a woman the council told to stop digging holes." She didn't argue with him. She didn't remind him what her father's notebook said, or explain the ash, or the bark, or the 41 degrees. She handed him the mattock, and then she picked up her own shovel and started at the far corner of the pit herself, working in silence beside him until the light went. At the end of that day, she split 1 stick of scrap pine from the 4th test pit, 3 weeks buried, dry as kindling from a shed, no ice on it anywhere, and handed him half the split without a word. He turned it over in his hands, ran a thumb along the clean pale grain of it, and didn't say anything about Pruitt's wages again. The 6th test pit was the one that held. 5.5 feet down through clay into sand, birch bark cured 11 weeks, ash an inch thick, drainage notches cut at a slope of near 30 degrees, packed in 4 tamped layers over 3 days rather than 1 hurried afternoon. She buried a full quarter cord in it in late November, told no one but Hollis, and didn't open it once, not even to check, for 5 full weeks, because her father's notebook said a cache disturbed early never sealed the same way twice. Bramble had settled by then, mostly. He still paced near the buried pit some evenings for no reason Eliza could name. Ears back, a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, and she came to notice that he did it most on the evenings before the weather turned. She started watching him the way her father must have watched his own dogs, and she started noting those evenings in the ledger too, alongside the depth measurements and the ash counts, because a dog that read weather better than the county almanac was itself a kind of instrument. The only person in Larkspur Hollow who still spoke to her about any of it, after the failed demonstration and Whitfield's letter, was Annie Finn, a widow near 70 who lived alone at the far end of the Hollow Road and had known Tobias Kirkland before Eliza was born. Annie came by twice that winter with nothing but a jar of preserves and a willingness to sit at Eliza's table and listen, and on the second visit, in early December, she said the thing that mattered. "Your father dug a cache the winter of the big one," Annie said. 68, or near it. Everybody else lost their wood to the ice that year, shed and all, and Tobias Kirkland had dry oak splitting like a July afternoon in the dead of February. Nobody remembers that now. I remember it. She said the barometric glass at her own window had dropped further and faster that week than she'd seen it drop in 11 years, and that the geese had gone through 2 weeks early and low, and that her late husband used to say a fast-dropping glass in December, paired with early geese, meant a storm that didn't announce itself gently. Eliza wrote that down too. Glass dropping fast, she noted, geese early, bramble pacing 3 evenings running. Warning enough for a woman nobody in town would listen to twice. The blizzard came the second week of December, and it came the way Annie's late husband had described it, without the gentle preamble of a lighter snow to warn the unprepared. It came in off a clear cold afternoon inside of 4 hours, wind first, then a wall of white that erased the tree line before supper. It ran 2 full days without a real lull, and by the time it broke, Larkspur Hollow had 18 inches on the level and drifts against the north walls of every building in town, standing taller than a man on horseback. Pruitt's shed, iron-strapped and shingled and full of 60 stacked cords, did not survive it as a functioning woodpile. The wind found the gap under the north eave that nobody had ever thought to seal, and it drove snow and then meltwater and then a hard refreeze into the stack from the top down, the same way frost works into a poorly capped well. By the second morning, the outer 3 rows of the woodpile were fused into a single sheet of icebound timber, and the men Pruitt sent in with axes came back out having managed less than a cord between 4 of them in 2 hours, arms shaking, one with a gashed hand from a glancing axe blow off frozen bark. Every other shed in the hollow that hadn't been built with a proper sealed roof and a raised floor fared no better. Wood was, within 2 days of the storm's start, the scarcest thing in town, and the poorhouse stove had gone cold by the second evening. Pruitt himself went out on the second night to try what his men couldn't, alone, in weather that had no business being walked in, because a man's pride does not always consult the thermometer before it sends him out a door. He didn't come back in an hour, and he didn't come back in 2, and it was Hollis Reed, riding the hollow road with his collar up against the wind on an errand for Annie Finn, who found him near the ditch below the woodyard, down on one knee against a drift with his lantern gone out and his hands past the point of being useful to him. Hollis brought him to the only place close enough and warm enough to matter, Eliza's cabin, half sunk into its hillside, low-roofed and snow-banked, but standing solid, with smoke still climbing steady from its chimney, because its owner had never once, in 4 months, doubted that her own woodpile would hold. She almost hesitated at the door, not at the sight of Pruitt. She'd have opened it for any man in that condition. But at what came after, when Hollis said there wasn't wood enough split and dry inside the cabin to keep a fire built up through a whole night at the pitch it would need for a man that far into the cold, and that the covered porch wood, exposed to 2 days of driving snow, was soaked clean through and useless. For one long moment, she stood in her own doorway with the wind screaming past the eave and did not move toward the cache at all. Some old, small voice in her insisting the buried wood was a fair weather idea, tested only against a mild December, not proven against a storm like this one, and that going out into it now to dig for something that might, after all, still be a slab of useless ice, was folly on top of folly. It was Bramble who broke the stillness, shouldering past her legs into the wind, and standing foursquare over the marker stake at the cache mouth, barking in a way she'd never once heard from him. Not the low, unsettled growl of a coming storm, but something sharper, more insistent, aimed straight at the ground. She went. She started digging at the wrong end of the drift at first, her hands moving faster than her memory, clawing at snow a full 3 feet north of where the actual cache mouth lay buried. A wrong first move born of cold and fear rather than of any failure in the method itself, until Hollis, digging beside her, called out that the marker stake was behind her, not ahead, and she stopped, breathed once, and corrected, driving her shovel down where her father's 41 degrees had been waiting, patiently under the snow the whole time. The cache mouth came clear in under 10 minutes. The seal held. No ice, no meltwater, no fused gray slab. Split oak and pine coming up loose and dry and cold but not frozen. Exactly as the notebook had promised. Exactly as 6 failed test pits and 1 long, quiet, humiliating winter had taught her it would. She and Hollis carried up an armload each. and inside 20 minutes Eliza had a fire built in her hearth hot enough to warm water for Pruitt's hands and feet, and blankets enough, and a stove-side chair close enough to the flame that by midnight the woodyard owner, who had once told the council a buried woman's firewood ought to stay buried, was alive, warm, and awake enough to understand exactly whose wood had done it. He didn't say much that night. Men rarely do. In the hour they understand they were wrong about something that nearly cost them everything. He watched the fire a long while, and then he watched Eliza's hands as she fed another split length into it, dry bark catching clean and fast. No hiss of trapped ice anywhere in the grain, and something in his face settled the way a man's face settles when an old certainty quietly gives way to a new one, without ceremony, without a word said aloud to mark the moment. By the time the storm broke fully on the third morning, word had gone through what remained of Larkspur Hollow that the Kirkland woman's buried wood had kept Silas Pruitt from losing fingers, or worse, in the ditch below his own useless shed. The council sent no letter this time. Whitfield himself came by once, briefly, hat in hand, and allowed that the town might do well to reconsider the terms of the relief woodlet contract come spring. Eliza thanked him for the visit and did not ask him to sit down. She did not need the crowd's accounting of it the way she might once have thought she did. What she carried afterward, in the weeks the town spent digging out and rebuilding sheds along different lines than before, was quieter than vindication and heavier than pride. A settled, private certainty, felt most strongly not in daylight among neighbors, but in the ordinary hush of her own evenings, when she'd sit at her table with her father's notebook open beside her own marbled ledger, comparing his hand to hers. 41 degrees circled in both now, and understand for the first time that she hadn't failed in October and succeeded in December. She had simply kept digging between the two. Hollis stayed on through the rest of that winter, splitting wood at wages she could actually pay him now that the contract had turned back her way, and some evenings he'd sit with her at that table while she wrote the night's measurements into the ledger, Bramble stretched by the fire with his ears finally, fully at rest. Annie Finn came by once more before the thaw, brought no preserves that time, only sat a while, and said that Tobias Kirkland would have been glad to see his notebook still earning its keep. There was no gathering in the town green that spring, no crowd to hear her speak on it, and she never once asked for one. What she told Hollis, on one of those quiet fireside evenings, when he asked her plainly why she'd kept at it after the council's letter, after the whole hollow had laughed her off the green, was not a boast, and it did not sound like triumph when she said it. It sounded, if anything, like something she'd only just finished proving to herself. A cache dug wrong will fail you every time, she told him, and a man who's failed once in front of everybody he knows will want, more than anything, to bury that failure and never look at it again. But the ground doesn't forget what's under it, and neither, if you're patient enough, do you. What breaks you open in October is only the first digging. The wood that keeps a man alive in a blizzard was never the wood you buried the first time. It was the wood you buried after you learned exactly why the first grave was the wrong one.